My guest today is a high priest and author who is returning to M3 to tell me all about his latest book. And yes, I did say returning, which means that somehow I've convinced someone to come on my show for a second time. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the father of American witchcraft, Raymond Buckland. But first, I want to give a quick shout out to my newest Patreon supporter, Jessica H. Jessica, welcome and thank you. Patrons like you really help keep this show going. All right, without any further ado, allow me to introduce Jason Mankey. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian, and today I'm speaking to author, high priest, and returning guest, Jason Mankey. Jason, thank you so much for coming back on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Am I your first returning guest?
You are my first returning guest.
Woo! I feel like something. This is a big deal. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, we're making history here.
Yeah.
You will always be my first returning guest. So you have cemented that role for yourself for all of history. Congratulations. Sweet. Yeah.
Woo!
It has been about 2 years since we spoke. So if anybody's watching and they did not see season 1, where Jason came on the show and talked about Greek gods and his background and all that stuff, I will link it in the top right corner. That's not an episode that you want to miss. It was a lot of fun. But what have you been up to since then, Jason?
Most of the last 3 years, I've been writing this book, High Priest, a biography of Raymond Buckland, a project unlike anything else I've ever done. It was super time consuming, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But that was the big deal. That was the big thing that I worked on. And then, of course, there's lots of, going to festivals, taking care of my wife, taking some little vacations here and there. But as a witch, this was the big thing. This was the, wow, I can't believe this is finally done thing.
Yeah, well, I remember like 2 years ago at Summer Magick, and we were talking. And first of all, we were talking about a lot of stuff there. And I did kind of like steal you away and surreptitiously ask your advice on writing a book. And you gave me some advice. And that has all panned out. So I do have to thank you for that. So that's awesome.
But so it was good advice.
It was good advice, yeah. Good. We won't tell anybody what it was. It was secret advice, but it was good advice. Magical, witchy book advice. So you did also show off like some pictures and research that you had been doing in the Buckland Museum, which was really cool. Before we get into the book, what can you tell me about the writing process and all the research that went into it?
So this was really different than anything else I've ever done because it is a biography. A lot of times biographies are written by people who think of themselves as biographers. That's all that they write. So going into this project, there was a lot of trepidation, a lot of worry, because it was unlike anything else I had ever done. I got very lucky. Ray had actually written a memoir before he passed. It's not a very good memoir, which is why that wasn't published. But at least it was sort of an outline of most of his life. He didn't quite finish it, but it had a lot of the information that moves you from point A to point B. And it was sort of like having him whispering in my ear while I was writing the book. So that was super useful for dates and a little insight into what he was thinking. But the memoir had real issues. It was a lot about, I love this Gremlin car that I had in 1972. It handled very well on the road, but the pickup wasn't quite enough. Ray really liked cars, so there would be long passages about cars in his memoir. And then a lot of it, too, was, I went on this radio station, and this radio station, and this radio station. Nobody cares, Ray. Nobody cares. It's just, it was more about, this is what I've done, and not what I think about what I've done. Right. But it was still really useful. So you start with that. And then there's little autobiographical bits in his books. So you look at those things. And then you had to talk to some people who knew Ray to get inside information. The most important of those people was Ray's widow, Tara Buckland, and she talked to me many, 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 many times and helped point me in the right direction. And then, of course, there is the Buckland Museum, which is a really great resource. It's actually run by people who do museum stuff, so they know how to take care of things. And Ray knew that what he had done in the history of witchcraft was important, so he kept a lot of his papers, and they let me go through those papers. And the thing that you're talking about is I stumbled upon a folder full of letters to Raymond Buckland from Gerald Gardner and then Monique Wilson, who was his initiator. And to me, that was sort of the big, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this historical thing that I got to document. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, I think it's really cool when you read the letters that these old prolific people in the craft have written to each other. Like you've got the letters from Ray and Gardner, and then like in Witchfather, there are all these letters from Gardner to other people. And it's just really interesting that people took the time to pen letters and put them in the mail, and they had to wait for responses. And now we're so crazy interconnected. If I don't get a response from my email within a few hours, I start getting antsy, like what's going on? So that's really cool. Do you feel like you got some special privileges at the Buckland Museum to do all this?
Absolutely. I don't think anybody who writes books had seen those letters before. I mean, they knew where they were. That's why they gave them to me, hoping that it might be of interest. But I don't think they'd ever really been documented and written about before. So that was a pretty big deal. We all know that Buckland got letters from Gerald Gardner. What was in those letters, though, had been a mystery. And now that's all published and people can see sort of the beginnings of modern witchcraft in the United States through those letters.
Yeah, it's really neat to read those letters. And you said in the book quite a few times that you are not a biographer, right? But you're still writing the biography. So, I mean, what was that feeling like to write that biography of somebody that is so important to the craft?
You've heard the phrase imposter syndrome before. That's what it felt like in a lot of ways. Actually, the first chapter that I wrote for the book was the chapter with the Gardner letters. So starting in this sort of weird spot that really interested me personally was really useful, because I felt if I could get through that spot, then I could go in and fill in the other blanks later. And that's ended up being how it worked out. But yeah, it is very strange writing a biography. Before I wrote it, I did read some books about how to write a biography, what's the best way to write a biography. And then I thought also a lot about the biographies that I've read over the years. And it always felt to me like there were two kinds of biographies: really short biographies, which read more like a magazine article in some ways, or really gigantic biographies. And I wanted to pen something in the middle. This isn't a short book, especially by the standards of witchcraft biography, because a lot of those are really short, with the exception of Heselton's Witchfather. And yeah, so I was happy. This is about 120,000 words, which is a lot for a witch book in the modern age, but not like scarily so, right? Because you don't want it to look like this and have people run away from it.
Well, I think one of the cool things about it is that it reads very casually. It does. It's not like a difficult read or anything, but it's also not just your words. You have all of these different perspectives from several other people in the craft who wrote in and gave you their little experience with Ray Buckland. One of the first things in there is Evo does his star chart, which is one of the coolest things to open a book with and really get a picture for who this guy is astrologically before you talk about who he is, right? So, I mean, how did that feel, getting everyone and, communicating with all these different people and getting all of their different perspectives to coordinate this effort?
That was an idea that Llewellyn had. I didn't want to do that because I don't really like bothering people. So I didn't want to have to go through and talk to people and then organize it. And there's release forms that people have to sign and things. I didn't want to put up with all that. But one of the things about Ray is that I didn't really know Ray. I met him one time and it was very fleeting. So I didn't have that personal interaction with Ray. And Llewellyn thought that I kind of wasn't capturing some of his personality. So they thought that if I went and found people who knew Ray, then we might be able to capture his personality a little bit better. And I love the little additions to the book. I mean, having Silver Ravenwolf in my book was like, wow, you know, I'm about ready to faint. I wrote a book about Ray Buckland and I had Silver Ravenwolf in my book. And to me, those figures were such important ones when I was a baby witchling. So to, you know, have that is a really big deal. So that, but that was Llewellyn's idea, was to include the other people. And the idea of doing the chart I stole from the recent sort of biography of Scott Cunningham by his sister Christine. Like, she included that in the book and I was like, that's a great idea. I'm going to steal that. And I've admitted to her that I stole it from her.
Well, I think it's really cool where there's all of these different voices chiming in and giving just a little perspective on Buckland, and you can kind of see the complete picture of just how many people he influenced based on how many different people you were able to get to write letters in for this book. So I do have a question, though. I am curious. What started the whole process? What was like, were you asked to do it? Was it kind of like was it your idea? Like who decided, let's write this biography?
It was Llewellyn's idea. I think it was in the middle of the pandemic in 2020. I think, right? And my editor's like, I have something I really need to ask you, and something that we'll have to talk about on Zoom. And I had a feeling it was coming, and I was going to say no. I really was going to say no. This was not in my wheelhouse. It looked too hard to do. But she was like, oh, you write about history in such an interesting way, and it doesn't put us to sleep at Llewellyn, and we think that you'd be the perfect person for this. So they really buttered me up, right? They said all these nice things about me. And then my neighbors at the time that I spent the pandemic with, you know, everybody had their little pod. These were the only people on our block who wanted to drink wine in a backyard on a regular basis. So absolutely, they became our best friends, and I love them. We still hang out all the time. But they were like, Jason, we think that this could take your writing career to another level. And I was like, no, it won't, because nobody reads pagan biographies. But I accepted because I thought, well, this will be a challenge. This will be something different for me to do, you know, and that's sort of fun as a writer, to do something that you've never done before. And I think Llewellyn had the memoir that Ray's widow had sent in. And, you know, she's asked, are you interested in this? And then they read the memoir and were like, no, we're not interested in publishing this, but we would be interested in publishing a biography of Ray. And whoever did it could use the memoir to help them write the biography. And that's sort of how I came into it.
Well, I mean, it is pretty prolific. Now you have the Raymond Buckland collection from Llewellyn, and now you're a part of, you know, you're a part of that. So that's pretty cool. Now, it's crazy that these ideas started like during the pandemic. So is this the longest that you have ever worked on a book?
It is. I mean, I signed the contract during the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I was still finishing the Horned God book, and then moved directly into the Greek Gods book. So it was still down the road, right? I knew that I'd signed a contract, but I still had to get through other things before I could, you know, work on this book. So I knew that it was going to be at least a year before I got to it. And it actually took me much longer than I contracted for to write the book. I think it was due in 2023. I finally sent it in March of 2024. And even then, I wasn't completely done with the book. I still had about 5,000 words to write. But I told my editor, you know, this is what I've got. I know you want it, and we're really behind. I'll fill in the other 5,000 words later. And she was okay with that. So, yeah, it was a long, long process. A lot of it was just, you had to go on the road to get information, right? And there were things that you just couldn't do from your house, right? You had to go to Cleveland, had to go to Llewellyn. I had a really great day at Llewellyn going through their archives. Carl Weschke, who was the president and owner of Llewellyn through Ray's time there, he kept a lot of the correspondence that he had with Ray. and copies of his correspondence to Ray. And that makes up a lot of the book in the 80s and the 90s, and especially the things about the Big Blue Book, which are one of my favorite parts in the whole of my book. So yeah, so it just took a while. And then, of course, that's all I said, Imposter Syndrome. It took a long time to really have the courage to sit down and start writing this book. Because I would start and I'd be like, I can't write about Ray Buckland. I can't tell his story, right? And yeah, that took a long time to get over.
Well, I think you definitely got a unique perspective. You're probably the only one in the world who has gone over all of these documents that you were able to have access to. So you definitely have, you're the person to have written this. So that's pretty cool. So you are also the best person to answer this question, Jason. Why Ray Buckland? Why did we need a biography on him? Why was he so important?
So this memoir was originally going to be called So Little Time, which was what Ray called his memoir. So that was the original sort of working title of the book. And then you send the book in, and Llewellyn gets to sort of choose your final title. They ask if you like it, but they choose your final title. And they chose High Priest Raymond Buckland, the father of American witchcraft. And I think it's really an apt title. He was one of the first public witches in the United States. Sybil Leek probably was the first when she immigrated to the United States and probably beat Ray by a little bit. It's also really telling that the first two public witches in the United States were both English, which is really kind of funny when you think about it. But he was one of the first public witches. He was one of the first witchcraft writers to live in the United States, to be an American. He brought the Gardnerian tradition to the United States in 1963, which is a really big deal. It's strange today to think of, oh, I have to be initiated to be a witch, right? Nobody thinks that so much anymore. But in the early 60s, really up until the late 70s, even in sometimes spilling into the 90s, depending on who you talk to, that was really a belief, right? You had to be initiated. And he brought that initiatory tradition into the United States. He helped come up with what today we call the outer court system within initiatory traditions. The outer court is a way to work with other witches in a tradition without being initiated yourself. And to me, I think it really helped shape eclectic Wicca in a lot of ways, because that's really what an outer court is. It's eclectic Wiccan practice, and he was there for that. He was one of the first witchcraft elders to say, hey, you don't have to be initiated by other people. You can do a self-dedication ritual, and it's just as effective and it's just as valid as anything else. And they said that in 1974 in his book, The Tree, on the tradition that he created, Seax-Wicca. And then, of course, there's the Big Blue Book, I would argue the most recognizable witchcraft book ever published. It's a giant blue book with a big pentagram in the middle, and it's looked that way now for 40 years. You know, there are other books that have sold as many copies and are just as important in history, but all of those books have changed cover many, many times. Buckland's Big Blue Book still looks kind of like it did 40 years ago. So for those reasons, I would say he's a pretty big deal. And there's a couple of other things that he did too. He came up with the thing that we today call the Law of Three, that what you do will come back to you 3 times in your lifetime. That was something Ray made up, and most people don't know that. So yeah, really big figure. I think he really deserved to have a biography written about him. And now that it's done, I'm really happy that I did it. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, no, I'm not happy. But now that it's done, I'm very happy that I got to do it.
Well, I'm definitely happy that you got to do it, because I think it is a really good thing for people to know about where all of these traditions came from, and how we can trace things back through some of the founders of the craft in the US. What can you tell me about Ray's tradition?
Wow. So I'm not I almost said I'm not a big fan of his tradition, which would be true because I'm not a practitioner of it. It was a very valiant attempt to create a tradition, and there are people who still practice the tradition. So I don't want to say anything bad about the tradition, but it is sort of a strange thing in that he changed a lot of words. right? So there were words that other witches used, and then he kind of made up his own words for some of those similar things. So when you read his book, The Tree, for instance, it's like, wow, this is really different, really out there, because of the terminology in it. But as I said before, this was the first tradition that said you could just self-dedicate and you were on par with any initiate, which was a huge deal. And Ray also, in the 70s, people are starting to write about acceptance. I'm going to just say the LG community, because that's all people knew that existed really in the 70s. That's all people talked about. So Ray starts writing about inclusion for gays and lesbians, which is a really big step in the craft, because there were a lot of homophobic practitioners for a very long time. So yeah, so the tradition did a lot of good, I think.
So you talk about this in the book a little bit, but can you explain how you felt when you met him?
It really wasn't much of a meeting. He was at a metaphysical convention in my little city of Lansing, Michigan, and he was the special guest. And he spent most of his time just sitting behind a table signing books. If you've ever read the Big Blue Book, it's very serious in tone. And I expected Ray to be this giant of a man who was very serious and never smiled and was sort of intimidating. And instead, there's this short man who's very sprightly and smiled a lot. So my expectations were not met, but they were exceeded because he was much more than what I thought he was going to be. He was much, much more approachable than I thought he would be. And he was nice to everybody there and was kind and seemed interested in what we were doing. But it was really just a small moment. I've always been really intimidated by pagans that have been formative to me. Like, I'm still a fanboy at heart. So it took me like over a day to get the courage to walk up to meet Raymond Buckland, because I, just didn't want to gush. I didn't want to embarrass myself.
Yeah. I think we get that feeling a lot from authors who we read books from. I mean, it's hard for me to go up sometimes after a workshop at a festival when it's an author that I really like. It was hard for me to come up and talk to you for the first time. So
I'm so approachable. I think I'm so approachable. Yeah. I met Ronald Hutton a couple of years ago, and Ronald Hutton is probably my favorite pagan-related author of all time. And he just writes history, but I love history, clearly. And so he was doing a book signing in London, and we just happened to be in London. And my wife filmed it with the hope that I would pass out when I met him.
Did you?
I did not. I did not. I was still embarrassing, though. I think he left quickly and quietly out the back door so he wouldn't have to talk to me and Thorne Mooney, because we were both gushing over him too much.
So I think you said that once Ray started writing, he wrote basically like a book every year until he died. And he had what, like 40 books published or something like that?
It maybe 60 books.
Wow.
I mean, it was just such a huge number. And it's kind of hard to keep track of, too, because a book would be republished with a different name. And then towards the end of his life, he did a lot of self-publishing. And some of those books are really more like pamphlets than books. So it's hard to quantify exactly what a book is sometimes. But yeah, he wrote all the time, but he really wasn't a full-time writer until the late 80s. Writing witchcraft books has never been particularly lucrative, even for the biggest names in the genre, really until the 90s. And then for a very short period of time, it was profitable. There was a witchcraft boom, and it was the age of Barnes and Noble and Borders, the book superstore. There were a lot of witchcraft books on the shelves, but not too many witchcraft books on the shelves, meaning that if you wanted a witch book, there were maybe 20 authors that you could choose from. So if you had a book on those shelves, that was a pretty big deal. And Ray had several books on those shelves. So for a short period of time, he made good money as a writer. But then all of a sudden, the internet pops up. The value of the printed word starts to go down. People are sharing PDFs online. And that's one of the reasons I think he got into self-publishing a lot the last 10 years of his life, because you're trying to make up some of that lost revenue that you used to get from your books. And yeah, so it's a tough world being a pagan writer, but Ray got to do it, longer than most people get to do it, and he got to do it as a full-time job for the last almost 30 years of his life, which is pretty good, but he was in his 50s before he became a full-time writer.
Yeah, that's amazing. And out of all those books, you would say that probably Big Blue is the most important?
I would say Big Blue is the most important, but really his career was sort of made when he came out with a book in 1970 called Practical Candle Burning Rituals. It's the rituals themselves are not particularly practical, I don't think, because they require 10 candles for each spell, which is a lot, but that book sold really well in the 70s, and even up till now, it's never gone out of print since it was published. I was at Llewellyn and I talked to Sandra Weschke, who is the widow of Carl, and she was talking to me about Ray, and she said that book kept the lights on at Llewellyn for a long time, which was a big compliment. I mean, they published some important things in the 70s, but Practical Candle Burning Rituals was, I think, the only book from that era to stay in print. And it was also really interesting in that it kind of walked two worlds. There were spells of the old religion for witches and pagans, and then spells of the new religion, which used psalms. They were basically the same spell, but the words that you would say were different, which I think is one of the reasons it sold so many copies. But that book is really overlooked now, but it was a really big deal at the time. And it says a lot that all of these years later, 55 years later, 54 years later, that it's still in print.
Yeah, people are still talking about it. Yeah, I would say it's a big deal. It was a big deal. Now, you obviously were exposed to a lot of different stories and perspectives about him. What were some of the more interesting details, maybe things that surprised you to learn?
Well, there were things that didn't make the book because I can't print speculation. But I remember I wrote one witchcraft elder and I asked her, would you be interested in writing about Ray, like a short reminiscence? And she's like, Ray was a misogynist. He was a plagiarizer. He was a con artist. I mean, it was all of this very negative thing. And it was completely different from what everybody else was telling me. And I found that really interesting, but I can't print speculation in a book. But I think anybody in the witchcraft community who's successful, there ends up sort of being a side that people don't like periodically, and you can't be friends with everybody. Ray didn't really have a whole lot of grudges, everybody has people they don't like. Even people I think who wronged him as a witch, he writes very positively about in his memoir, except for two people. And yeah, so that sort of negativity was a big surprise.
Okay. I have heard through hearsay, some of the negative opinions on him, but I think you portrayed him in the correct way. If you're going to write a biography on somebody, you can leave the hearsay out and just talk about what we know happened. So that's good.
There are times I know that I caught him in lies, right? I mean, there were things that he said were not truthful. He liked to pass himself as a PhD. He was clearly not a PhD, and he got called out on it by people in the pagan community. And then he would try to make up excuses about it. And even in the last 10 years of his life, he still had notepads that said Raymond Buckland, PhD. I mean, by that point, he had bought a PhD from the Universal Life Church, but that's not really an accredited institution, right? So yeah, there were things about him that were not necessarily truthful. The biggest revelation in the book, Ray had always said that Gerald Gardner was at his initiation. That was something that was repeated over and over and over again. And I think looking at the available evidence, it's pretty clear that Gerald Gardner was not at his initiation, even though Buckland repeated that story his entire life from 1963 onward. So yeah, he wasn't always honest, but I mean, A lot of witches tell tall tales. I think oftentimes they're trying to present the craft in this really positive light, so they embellish things. Like, I'm a PhD at something that Gerald Gardner did. I think saying Gerald Gardner was at his initiation was a way to give an extra layer of credibility to his initiation, because there are times within traditions where people will be like, "Oh, you didn't really get initiated," or "That person isn't a valid initiate who initiated you." So he was trying probably to take care of the people that he and his wife Rosemary did initiate later.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say that I hope that was more prevalent back in the day, like when the craft was in its infancy and people were trying to paint these larger than life pictures of themselves to maybe help attract followers. So hopefully now that we've gotten away from a little of that, but certainly there's still people out there that do that.
Have I never told you about being initiated by my grandmother at the age of 4 and becoming let's see. No.
An ancient tradition, right? That she was practicing, right. That she initiated you into. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That is a common story. No. So we all have opinions about these people that we hear a lot about in the craft, right? Mm-hmm. When you were writing this biography and you heard from all of these people and you did all of this research, did your opinion about Buckland change at all?
Well, I think I already knew that he wasn't as serious as the books led on, but I think he was even funnier than I knew. It was really fun to go to YouTube and watch his comedy routines, which are kind of funny. I mean, they're like dad joke funny, but they're still funny. And this was really towards the end of his life, within the last 3 years that he was alive. So that changed my opinion on him a lot. I also liked seeing the evolution in thought. I think Ray, as he got older, wanted the circle to expand more and more. He wanted a place for everybody in the circle, regardless of identity, which, as I said earlier, was a big deal in a lot of early witchcraft circles. And I think he wanted a place for the LGBTQ community. And I think that's really great. And it's really reflected in his writing. You can see how he changes over time. So I like people who progress as human beings. It feels like as we get older, we regress. We become more and more conservative. And in the case of Ray, it felt like he became more and more liberal and open and inclusive. And so that was a really good feeling.
That is a nice feeling, and it's nice to hear about that. And I hope that in general, with the craft, we keep going that way. I remember reading some of the jokes that you put in there, and they were just like such dad jokes. Like, oh, my foot's asleep, now it's going to be up all night, and just stuff like that. It's terrible, but it made me laugh. But you can watch his comedy routines on YouTube.
Oh yeah, they're all there. That's where I got to watch them. And I knew that they existed before I started writing the book, because people were kind of sharing them on Facebook back in 2015, 2016, I think those are the times when he was doing a lot of that. But only real giant history nerds like myself bothered to watch them, because you can see the amount of views, right, on a YouTube video. It would be like 212. 101, right? They were really small. So I guess I was just in the right circles where people thought that was something that I would want to see.
Well, I want to see it now. All right, I'm going to find a link and I'm going to put it in the video description so that everyone can be exposed to Buckland's.
I know the links are in the book because they had to be footnoted, right? So yeah, so there's like YouTube things.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to link those in the video description. So after all of this, Jason, what is your next book going to be? Do you have any plans?
I'm writing The Great Goddess of the Witches, which is sort of a companion piece to The Horned God of the Witches. So it's my book about the goddess. Today I'm sort of known as the Horned God guy, but when I got involved in witchcraft, it was because of the goddess. That was my focus for several years. And I want to write about the evolution of how the goddess is seen in modern witchcraft. it's a really sort of big task in a lot of ways. And the more I work on it, the more I think I've bit off more than I can chew. But I want to look at individual goddesses that I think have really sort of influenced how we see sort of the bigger goddess picture within witchcraft, and then look at that evolution of, the great lady, the one figure that people talk about. And, along with things like Maiden Mother Crone. And of course, there'll be rituals and activities to grow closer to the goddess in the book. But yeah, that's the latest. As soon as I'm done with festival season this year and talking about this book, because there's, when you have a book come out, there's always a lot of podcasts and things because you're desperate. Yes. So you're desperate for people to find out that you spent 3 years of your life writing this book.
That's really cool. I'm really looking forward to that. And in the Horned God of the Witches, so you pick out a few specific like god forms in there, the Green Man, Cernunnos, Pan. Do you have an idea of like specifically which named goddesses you might talk about in this upcoming?
I do, and it sort of varies, as I think about the book. Originally I had like one outline, and then sometimes I add more to it. But obviously, you're going to have goddesses like Hecate in that book. Probably the Morrigan. To me, Aphrodite is important. Diana, Artemis, Aradia, they kind of all go together. Those to me, Bridget, maybe those are sort of the bigger ones. It seems like a lot of them end up being Celtic or Greek. Probably because that's the most mythology that we have. We have all this great Greek mythology to draw upon. And then there was this idea for a long time that Wicca especially was Celtic. So there's always been this big interest in Celtic deity amongst modern pagans. So I think that those were the two most formative traditions. So there's a lot about that. There's also going to be a chapter on like the lost years of the goddess. And I want to talk about some of the sort of Christian influences or Christian stealings, because today too, like if you talk to people, there are a lot of people who are close to Lilith, which is a figure really out of Jewish folklore that has become a goddess, right? I mean, that these are her origins, and then all these people are worshiping her today. So clearly she is a goddess. And I want to write about that and a little bit about, Mary and Mary Magdalene too. I know pagans who have done camps. There's reclaiming is a tradition of witchcraft, and they do witch camps, and there's often a theme. And in one of their witch camps, I know they did Mary Magdalene as a theme. So I find that influence really fascinating on how we view goddesses and how people are incorporating things that maybe I wouldn't incorporate at this point in my life. But I think there's always this desire to sort of reconcile perhaps the religion of your youth with the religion of your adulthood.
Well, I will really look forward to that release. That sounds super interesting. So you did mention that you've got a whole festival season lined up. So before I get to the signature question, which won't be the same signature question that I asked you last time, before I get there, how about telling people where you will be and where they can find you in person and online?
So I'm one of 3 Jason Mankeys in the entire country of the United States. So I'm really easy to find online, much to the chagrin of the other Jason Mankeys, one of whom I think is a preacher. So I feel sorry for that guy, and I don't, all at the same time. This summer, I've got a lot of bookstore appearances. I'm going to be at the Buckland Museum the weekend of the summer solstice. I think that's the 20th. I'm not looking at my calendar, so I don't remember all the exact dates. Crazy Wisdom in Ann Arbor, Michigan on the 27th. I'll be at the Free Spirit Gathering in August. The following week, I will be at the Harvest Gathering in Connecticut. And then I'll be at Reno Pagan Pride. There's got to be a Vegas event in there somewhere because there's always a Vegas event. And then I'm doing a Pagan Pride Day in Washington State. So there's a lot of stuff, and I just got back. Oh, and I'm doing a Druid Festival this weekend, depending on when this goes out, called 8 Winds. Yeah, it's been a lot of things.
That is a loaded schedule, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then earlier this year, there was Convocation, Paganicon, Pagan Unity Festival, the Spring Mysteries in Seattle, Washington. There's always a lot of events, which is fun. I love people. I love getting out. I love teaching. I love all of that so much more than writing. Writing is just so solitary, and I like people so much. So being able to go to events is really fun.
Well, for anybody looking to find any of those events, I will take all of the links and put them in the video description below, along with the links to Raymond's stand-up comedy routine and along with the links to Jason's social handles. So if you are looking for any of that information, all you'll have to do is go below and click and you'll find it. So Jason, last episode, I asked you how you use sound or music in your personal magical practice. And you gave a really great answer. You talked about music connecting you to the wheel of the year. And I think that was beautiful. So I want to ask you today, what is your favorite musical memory?
Wow, that is a really great question. My favorite. There's so much, but I'm gonna. I remember once in ninth grade for Christmas that year, my brother bought me Led Zeppelin 4. That's Led Zeppelin's fourth album, the one with the cymbals on it, Stairway to Heaven's on it, Battle of Evermore. I could tell you the complete track listing in order, but I listened to it, and I remember like getting to rock and roll. Like we can't do that because if you have to clear stuff. So I won't sing it, and it'd be terrible if I did. But I remember listening to it and then just twirling around in my room. I was like so moved that I had to move. There was just some sort of power in that Led Zeppelin, and I just ran around in circles until I was dizzy for the whole 3 minutes and 45 seconds of the song or whatever else. And I listened to a lot of music at that time, but I don't remember ever feeling anything so physical that it made me want to do something like that. So Led Zeppelin, I think it would be that Led Zeppelin memory. And then that sparked a love of Led Zeppelin that brought me to paganism. So I would not be sitting here today with you without Led Zeppelin. And it probably all started with those circles to rock and roll.
So do you use that song? Like that song has a lot of energy for you. And do you use that in ritual today ever?
No, because my coven would be really mad at me if I made them run around until they were dizzy to rock and roll. Just we'll keep that something quiet that I do.
Okay.
By myself. Yeah. Lots of music in ritual, of course, but not that particular song. And I think if I were to use a Led Zeppelin song in ritual, it would be the Battle of Evermore. I think that has sort of this hypnotic effect, and it has sort of the right mood for certain types of ritual.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you mentioned that song last time I asked you to. So if anybody hasn't heard the last time that Jason answered, go back and watch that episode too, because it's really interesting. But for now, Jason, I think I will close the call. I really appreciate you coming back on the show, being my first returning guest. Clearly, I have convinced you that this is a good idea to do more than once. So
no, it's really an honor. It's really cool. Come back and be my first ever second time guest. You feel like, oh, maybe I'm not terrible at this, right? It's a real honor. I'm like giddy. I'm kind of blushing, and you can't see because of the weird light in the room. But yeah, thank you. This is great, and you're good at this too. There are a lot of people who are not good at doing podcasts, Eric, and you're good at it. Anytime. This is a real pleasure.
Thank you. I'm glad that you said that. Everyone can hear it now. So let it be official. No, thank you, Jason. I'm humbled by you coming here and taking your time to talk to me. So thank you. And on that high note, I will end our call. Thank you. What a great interview, and another big M3 thank you to Jason for taking the time to be with me on the show today and for sharing all of those interesting details about Raymond Buckland. If you haven't already grabbed a copy of his latest book, High Priest, I would highly suggest you do so right now, and you should also check out his other books. They're all great. I will link those in the video description below. And while you're clicking around down there, are you subscribed to my YouTube channel? If not, I would highly appreciate it if you did. That small click makes a huge difference to me. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, or other social media at Eric Arcadian. But if you really want to help support me making more content in the future, you should check out my Patreon page. Patrons get early access to these interviews before anyone else, plus some other exclusive content as well. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.